What do we know about the Buddha's birth and the first few years of his life? Very little, in fact, from the early texts. There's really only one major sutta that discusses the earliest part of the Buddha's life, and it's a strange sutta. And that's what's going to be the topic of today's video, the Acharya Abhuta Sutta, or the sutta known as Incredible and Amazing. In rough outline, the sutta that we have in Pali begins with a number of monks extolling the Buddha's amazing sort of supernormal qualities. And in response, the Buddha's close attendant Ananda, he responds by saying that all Buddhas have amazing qualities. At that point, the discussion between Ananda and these monastics is interrupted. A bunch of things happen. They return to come back to an assembly of monastics. The Buddha is there, and the Buddha asks Ananda then to go through his amazing qualities. So just to start off with, it's sort of an odd presentation. It sounds as though the Buddha is basically fishing for compliments. In any event, what follows from that is that Ananda lists a number of amazing and incredible qualities of the Buddha. It's clearly a mythological type of list, talking about the Buddha's prior lifetime, the Buddha's youth, the Buddha's mother, the Buddha's birth, intercessions of various deities, amazing lights in the sky, earthquakes, things like that. In particular, it's only from this sutta that we learn about the Buddha's birth, which is a matter I'll get to in a minute. In any event, after Ananda's long list of these incredible and amazing qualities of the Buddha's youth and the Buddha's prior lifetime and the deities and so on, the Buddha responds to all of this long litany of amazing things, with his own explanation of his own amazing and incredible qualities. Here's what the Buddha has to say. He says, "It's that the Tathagata, that is the Buddha, knows feelings as they arise, as they remain, and as they go away. He knows perceptions as they arise, as they remain, and as they go away. He knows thoughts as they arise, as they remain, and as they go away. This too you should remember as an incredible and amazing quality of the Tathagata." So in response to this long list of amazing and incredible qualities of the Buddha, he responds simply by noting a more dharmically relevant, but much more down-to-earth quality, the ability to be constantly mindful and aware. Now, there are a number of problems with this sutta on historical and even on dharmic grounds. The scholar Pia Tan has a long essay about that. I'll leave a link to that essay down below in the notes if you want to read more from him. In any event, this sutta has parallels. In particular, it has a parallel in Chinese. What I've been talking about so far is the Pali example. It has a parallel in Chinese, but the Chinese parallel is different in many key respects. There are different lists of incredible and amazing qualities in each. In the Pali version, Ananda claims that he heard this list from the Buddha himself, so he's just repeating what he's heard from the Buddha back to the Buddha, which doesn't really make a whole lot of sense, but in any event, that's the way it's told. In the Chinese, there's no claim that Ananda heard these from the Buddha. Also, in the Chinese version, the list of incredible and amazing qualities begins, the first one on that list is the Buddha's bodhisattva vow, his vow to become a Buddha under the prior Buddha Kassapa. No similar claim of a bodhisattva vow exists in the Pali version, however. And this is probably, perhaps, a sort of a Mahayanist interpolation into this sutta, because one of the key inventions or innovations in the Mahayana approach to Buddhism is this idea of the bodhisattva vow, that one makes a vow to become a full Buddha, therefore putting off one's enlightenment until full Buddhahood. And Pia Tan notes in his article, in his essay, that other descriptions of the Buddha's time with Kassapa, this prior Buddha, don't mention the bodhisattva vow. They don't mention the Buddha making such a vow in front of Kassapa. So this example of the vow in this Acharya Abhuta Sutta that we're discussing today may indeed be a very early introduction of the idea of a vow. Perhaps the most incredible and amazing story in this sutta, however, is the story of the Buddha's birth. It's a story that, in some ways, seems to be at odds with certain aspects of the early Dharma. It also, by being at odds with certain aspects of the early Dharma, makes this sutta a kind of an effective bridge to certain aspects of the Mahayana approach to the Dharma. We learn in this sutta that the Bodhisattva, that is to say the Buddha-to-be, he was not yet a Buddha, Gautama, the Bodhisattva, that when he was born, he stood up and he took 7 steps. And then he made an utterance. He was able to speak at birth, and this is what he said. I am the foremost in the world. I am the eldest in the world. I am the first in the world. This is my last rebirth. Now there are no more future lives. Now, the Chinese version of this sutta does not include this utterance of the Bodhisattva, the young Bodhisattva, after his birth. However, the utterance does appear in other places in other languages, so it does seem to have been part of many sort of early understandings of the Dharma. And while this utterance does have a clear mythic role to play in the sort of hero's journey of the journey to becoming the Buddha, this sort of greatest of all humans, as it were, nevertheless, there are many ways in which it does not play very well with other aspects of the early Dharma, which is something that Pia Tan notes. In particular, this utterance seems to imply that the Bodhisattva was aware of his impending enlightenment at his birth. Now, this, again, does not seem to play very well with the idea that the Bodhisattva had to undergo a long period of searching, of being lost in the wilderness, trying to find the route to enlightenment, trying to find the proper way. Many early texts are essentially didactic. They teach us the route to enlightenment, the Buddha does, by reference to his own search, that he had to go through this procedure of searching out the way, and that search can be a kind of an impetus to us in our own search. But this approach to the gradual path towards enlightenment is only very effective if we can see ourselves as essentially like the Buddha in certain respects. If, on the other hand, the Buddha is sort of wholly different, if the Buddha didn't really have to search, then a lot of the early methods of teaching don't seem to be quite as effective. This process by which a great founder is looked up to as more than being human, and as the founder recedes in time, as they're no longer present, their humanity seems to disappear and their divinity seems to increase, is known as docetism, creeping docetism. Docetism is this tendency that we have to deify the founders of whatever the religion or belief system is that we're interested in. This is where ordinary devotionalism becomes a kind of hagiography, making the person more than simply human, to the point at which he becomes essentially deified. As the scholar Jonathan Silk notes, the infant upon his birth knows everything. The young man he becomes knows nothing. That is, this description of the Buddha's birth, if we take it not as mythology but as a kind of a history, it doesn't seem to play very well with the material we have in other early Buddhist texts. So, what's going on here? Well, it's clear, I think, that what we have is a myth and not an attempt at making history. Still, in the early tradition, we have many myths, few of which I think play with so much difficulty with the other material in the early texts, which I think gives us reason to believe that this particular portion of this text, at least, must be relatively late. It's impossible to say for sure how all of this text developed, how this incredible and amazing sutta developed, but here at least is one potential reconstruction. In the beginning, perhaps, the sutta would have been relatively short, with Ananda lauding certain amazing qualities of the Buddha in his presence. And then at the end, we can imagine the Buddha with perhaps a wry smile on his face saying, yes, all of that is quite amazing, but what's really amazing about me is that I can be forever mindful. In other words, these other claims about me, they're fun and interesting, but they're not what's most dharmically relevant. Then, after the Buddha's passing, we can imagine that this sutta would have taken on greater importance. The importance involved in hagiography, in understanding the Buddha as greater than human, in a sort of a devotional sense. Because as the Buddha was no longer present, devotionalism around him would have grown up, or I should say in his absence would have grown up. Not long following his passing would have been the beginning of the schism between the different schools. The early Mahayana, the other schools, there would have been different incredible and amazing qualities highlighted in each one. So in the early Mahayana, we might have, for example, as I said, a description of the earliest vow that the Buddha would have given as a bodhisattva. In other schools, that wouldn't have been as present. But in both schools, there would have been this tendency towards docetism, towards viewing the Buddha as a semi-deified kind of character, one who would have been potentially able to speak at his own birth, who would have had perhaps some foresight of his own enlightenment. However, fortunately, all of these different, or at least the two that I'm discussing mostly here, the Pali and the Chinese, both retained the Buddha's kind of wry response at the end of all of this. His claim, his down-to-earth claim, that all of that was very interesting, but that the incredible and amazing quality that he seemed to be most invested in was the amazing and incredible quality of mindfulness and awareness. If you're interested in more discussions of the Buddha's kind of demythologization of views around him at the day, I have an earlier video on that topic. I'll leave a link to it up here on the screen if you haven't seen it. If you're getting something out of these videos of mine, consider taking a look at my Patreon page, which is linked up here on the screen and down below in the notes, and see if you want to help support the channel and the work that we're all doing here. Thanks so much, and we'll catch you on the next one, and meanwhile, all of you, be well.